I think that that is an amazing lesson for today as we look at the state of the world. And we're always wanting to, get more power, get more attention, get more fame. But look at what that costs, and look how it hurts the people around you. And I think that goes back to looking at, how the women in these plays are portrayed, Clytemnestra and Medea.
Hi, and welcome to the Innovative Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Isolde Trachtenberg. On the show, you get my conversations with peak performing thought leaders, creatives, and entrepreneurs. We explore how you can innovate through creativity, compassion, and collaboration. I believe that innovation combined with compassion and creative thinking can save the world, and I aim to bring you ways you can do it too. If you're enjoying the show, I'd be super grateful if you can support it by buying me a cup of coffee. You can buy me a cuppa at buymeacoffee.com/Isolde T. And now, let's get on with the show. Hey there, and welcome to the Innovative Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Isolde Trachtenberg. I'm super happy that you're here, and I'm really honored and happy to have today's guest on the show. Check this out, and you will know that my inner Greek mythology nerd is going to be so super happy to talk to this gentleman. Adam Oliver Stokes holds degrees in religion from Duke University and Yale Divinity School. He has published on a variety of topics, including biblical studies, Mormon studies, classical studies, and ancient American history. He's the author of 3 books, From Egypt to Ohio, A Semitic Origin for the Giants of North America. Can't wait to talk about that one. Perspectives on the Old Testament and the Latin Scrolls, selections from the 5 Megillot taken from the Latin Vulgate. He currently teaches Latin at Penns Grove High School in New Jersey and lives in Edgewater Park, New Jersey with his wife and 2 sons. How exciting is this going to be? Adam, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Great to be here, Zola. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm so excited to talk to you, in part because let's just jump on in. What got you started? I know what got me started, reading Bulfinch's mythology when I was 9 years old. What got you started? What fascinated you about these ancient cultures and civilizations that you decided to make it your life's work?
Yeah, well, I think it goes way back to my seventh grade Latin teacher, Mr. Buto. My mom forced me to take Latin. I went in kicking and screaming. Um, my dad thought it was kind of a pointless class to take. He thought it was, a dead language. But into about a week or so of the class, this was, my goodness, Isolde, this is about almost 30 years ago. Into about a week into the class, I was hooked. And the reason I was hooked is that Mr. Buto was kind of an unconventional Latin teacher.
Mm.
Not saying, I mean, he knew his stuff left and right. Definitely one of the finest linguists I've ever encountered in my life. But he made it interesting for us. There's a way to teach Latin where it can be really boring
Mm.
and just really dry. And he just, how can I say it? He spiced it up. He brought in a lot of Roman history. He brought in a lot of mythology. And I think at the time, I was in middle school, going into high school. I was kind of a nerd. I was kind of one of the awkward kids. Didn't really quite fit in. So the ancient world was kind of my escape, and I just fell in love with it. Basically, from the first time I started to engage in it. And I knew that in college, I wanted to be my trajectory to be towards looking at ancient civilizations.
I love that a teacher inspired you to this because, yeah, there are a lot of people who think Latin is a dead language, but it's the root of so many languages that knowing it can only be of benefit. So let me ask you a question. You teach Latin. Do you spice it up for your students? And if so, what is it that you do?
Oh yes, oh yes. Well, my school, I absolutely love the school that I teach at Penns Grove. To give you some of the demographics about that school, about 40% of the school I teach at is made up of Latino students,
Mm.
Latino and Latina students. So they come in with Spanish, and it's really cool because I can hook them early on and say, Spanish comes directly from Latin. So I bring in a lot of my focus is looking at the ways that Spanish intersects with Latin, what words are exactly the same. as in Spanish as they are in Latin. So, for example, to geek out here, the second person singular two is the
Hmm.
same in Spanish as it is in Latin. But I also do a lot of what Mr. Buto did as well. We're always, in fact, sometimes we do more Roman history and Greek mythology than translation of text themselves. So we've looked at basically everything from the Iliad to the Odyssey. We've looked at the various Roman emperors. I really like the bad emperors, the naughty emperors, the
Who
ones
are
who
the
caused
naughty
trouble.
emperors?
Oh gosh, well, there's a bunch of them, but I'll say we focus a lot on Caligula. We also focus on Nero. So those were the bad guys.
Mm.
My favorite emperor, he wasn't actually bad, but I always highlight him, and we must spend about a month on this guy. Is the Emperor Claudius, and the reason that I
Oh,
do that is because Claudius likely, well, one, there was a whole mini series of him with my favorite actor who I would gladly divorce my wife for and marry, Derek Jacobi, Sir Derek
wonderful.
Jacobi, whom I
Yeah.
absolutely love. Um, but also, we know from sources that Claudius had some type of disability, that he was possibly autistic or something like that. And so I have some students who are dealing with disabilities themselves. So I always point to him, and students always seem to appreciate this. I point to him and say, this was a guy who, in spite of his disability, rose to be the emperor, the ruler of the known world at the time. And he's just a fascinating figure, not only for himself, but the way that he intersects with all these different other figures in history, Caligula, Herod, Agrippa, in Jewish history, Tiberius, Augustus. He intersects with basically all the greats. So we do a lot of stuff with the emperors. I actually have like an emperor battle that they have to do. They have to argue effectively. So get into little small groups and have to argue effectively which emperor was the worst. So there'll be Nero or Caligula, and they have to give the reasons why. Or they'll even, this is a project I'm going to have them do in the upcoming months. They will choose an emperor and kind of have to do a campaign for that emperor. So if you want to get this emperor elected, if you want to get him voted into office, which of course didn't happen in the Roman world, the emperors just were chosen to be emperor or from their lineage. But if it was modern times and you were trying to get Nero elected, what could you do to get him? What would you say about him? How would you depict him to get elected? So there's campaign slogans and all that stuff.
Now, is this all in Latin?
Most of it is, yes. So
Wow.
so a lot of their projects they'll basically write out a slogan in Latin. So or write out a description in Latin. So they'll write out something in English, translate into Latin, and then use that as their template.
That's so incredible. And I love that you do that, that you get them so engaged and involved and not just sitting down, which I think is phenomenal because often just sitting down for a long time, no matter what you're studying, is going to be tougher on a student
Yes.
than getting up and actually doing and having a campaign. So, what is the best slogan someone's ever come up with for one of the emperors?
I think so. I did a similar project at the school I taught at earlier before I came to Penn's Grove, and I think the best one was "At least this emperor won't feed you to the lions." So I think it was Titus or Vespasian, and comparing him to Nero. I think they were the two emperors up for election, and yeah, I think that one I always get a kick out of. So it can't be as bad as getting fed to the lions.
That's actually probably true. So, let me it's I love what you do as a teacher, but you're also an author and you write and you publish works, and I know that this is going to sound a little weird, but when when you're doing this, when you're you're writing for a modern audience, writing for a contemporary 2021 audience,
Yeah.
and you're writing about these things that happened thousands of years ago, perhaps even longer. How do you make how do you make it relevant to the audience of 2021, and what lessons can we as your readers learn to take into our future from these ancient civilizations and ancient stories?
That's a great question, and that's something that is always, like you said, a challenge for anybody trying to, convey ancient history to modern readers. I've read so many, not to knock other textbooks, but especially within biblical studies and Old Testament, there's so many textbooks that just give dry explanations of things. So um, you'll read a textbook and they'll say these are the books of the Hebrew Bible, this is their content, blah 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 blah. But it doesn't really talk about how this stuff is relevant today. And even though the Bible was written thousands of years ago, for one, it is a text that is still accepted as scripture by large groups of people today, Jews and Christians, and also, I think just because it was the primary Western document for so long, it continues to have effects, both good and bad, for our culture and for our society. And so, one of the challenges and one of the things that I tried to do in writing both perspectives of the Old Testament and the Latin scrolls was to show the how the Bible, or at least how pop culture has understood the Bible, still has implications for issues that we deal with today. So in my Perspectives of the Old Testament book, there's an article in there about uh, the treatment of Israelites towards foreigners. And I tied that article directly into the current discussion about immigration and treatment of foreigners here in America, when at a time when there is increased xenophobia. Um, in my other book, The Latin Scrolls, there's actually, and I was advised to do this by my editor, and I think it was a great idea, Isolda. I was advised to put a section at the end of each of the Megillah, each of the scrolls that I translated. What is the relevance of this scroll for today? At the end of each of the translations, there's discussion about the contemporary relevance of the content in each of the scrolls. So, for example, the scroll to the book of Esther, I say, well, Esther was this average person who suddenly got skyrocketed, to the highest status in society. She suddenly was thrust into the court of the most powerful people in the world. What happens when this happens to you? And I gave an example from my own life. I actually, when I was at Duke, just little known me from Baltimore, 5'2", actually got in the same class with the Prince of Jordan and actually became friends with him. And so
Mm.
I cited that as an example. What do you do when you basically you encounter a situation where you're suddenly thrust amongst very powerful people? What ways might you use this not only to your own benefit, not to sound selfish, but also to the benefit of others, as Esther does? So I try to raise questions like that. Song of Songs, for example, another one of the Megillot. What does this say about sexuality? We think of sex, and we think of something that is, I think, still in the modern West, um, due to the influence of Christianity for so long. We think of sex as something that is taboo. But what does Song of Songs say about sex? This is a very healthy sexual relationship. How might this be relevant? How might this differ from talking to my college students, many of whom come from strong Catholic backgrounds? How might this differ from what you've heard? How might this be a positive way of understanding sexuality? So I do bring that stuff in. I bring that stuff in, try to bring it in quite often. And it makes the class much more interesting. Some of the reflection papers I get from students, some of the ways that they answer these are really really profound, and they stick with me just as much as I hope my class sticks with them.
It's so interesting to me how often, as a teacher, you learn from your students almost as much as they learn
Oh
from you.
yes, oh yes, absolutely.
So when you're in that state and you're looking at something, a document like the Old Testament, and you see some things that the Song of Songs is a great example of something that we can really learn from, and that can be of benefit, of increasing kindness and tolerance towards people who are not the same as you, especially, and also
Yes.
immigration with xenophobia. And yet there are times when you look at something like the Bible and you go, really? you believed that,
Yeah.
don't eat crustaceans or don't
Yes.
mix your fabrics or whatever. So how do we as modern people incorporate that into our viewpoint of a document like the Old Testament? Because some of it, frankly, is just so jarring. Like, don't some of the stuff that's pretty violent, and some of the stuff that make doesn't make a lot of sense, like don't eat
Yeah.
crustaceans or whatever. Or I'm vegan, so it's easy for me not to eat crustaceans and not to eat pigs. But at the same time, how do we do that? How do we reconcile in our own selves when we see such guidance and advice that is so uh, dated, I'll say.
Yeah, yeah. And I do a section on the Abraham tradition in the book of Genesis, and I always get to that horrible chapter in Genesis 18 where the angels come to Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot basically says, to the men of the city, I'll just don't do anything to these male angels, but I'll throw my daughters out of the door to you, so that you can have your way with them. And that's one of many jarring scenes in the Old Testament. I think the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible has to be taken like any other historical text. Now, granted, it's had much more of an influence than some other ancient texts have, but I think, as I think Jesus would say, you have to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff. Recognize that, and I think that biblical scholarship, having its basis in the European Enlightenment and people like Spinoza, I think it does as well. Recognize that this is an ancient text written by human beings, that the morals of their time are much different than the morals of our time. But there's still stuff that you can wean from this, from certain books, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, etc., that still have value for today and how we interact and how we treat others. So I think excellent example. I heard a lecture. I can't remember who gave the lecture, but it was a woman who's a classicist, and I'm blanking on her name right now. She did a lecture on the Iliad, and basically saying, um, this basically the mindset of all these guys in the Iliad just for bloodshed and plunder that you get with Agamemnon and Achilles, and basically all of them. They're uh, all kind of crud in that regard.
Mm,
But you can also still take away some moral lessons from Homer, not just the Iliad, but she was talking about the Odyssey as well.
hmm
And basically, what does it mean to be a virtuous person? Now, virtue looks different for someone like Achilles or Agamemnon, 2,500 years ago. But I think we can still ask that question as modern people: what does it mean to be virtuous in our time? What does it mean to be noble in our time? And the writings of Homer and the other Greek classics bring these questions to mind. Those questions are timeless. Those questions are eternal, and they'll be around long after we aren't.
Absolutely. I agree with you. Those questions are timeless. Some of the answers make me cringe, but the
Yes.
questions themselves, all you have to do is look at something like the Oresteia and
Yes.
wow, what happened there was just
Hot mess.
wow. So when I look at those ancient texts and I look at, oh, you killed my father, so now I'm going to kill you and this and that and
Everybody
and,
else.
and then
Yep.
because he sacrificed the daughter and all of these different things.
Hmm.
I look at that and I go, okay, if Clytemnestra, let's say she was the wife in the Oresteia, and her husband, the king, sacrificed his
Their daughter.
daughter.
Yeah.
All of these things happen, and so she was taking revenge, right? She was taking revenge, and she also had a lover, and it's a very dramatic and exciting and bloody story.
Oh yes.
But that's what was this is going to be a very feminist question. What was the woman's role here? What kind of power did Clytemnestra have besides doing what she did in that time? And how do we, again, as modern people, look at these tales and say, okay, this is maybe what Clytemnestra could do, this is what the path that was open to her, or the Medea is another
Yeah.
great example.
Yeah.
What could we do as women in those times versus what lessons we can learn in modern times from these ancient tales?
Yeah, yeah, and I think I think that a lot of the Greek tales, especially, I think there's a subliminal message of sympathy for these women like Clytemnestra, like Medea, in saying that they're kind of literally restrained
Mm,
by the culture and the time period that they find themselves in, and being married to these men who have absolute power and are kind of, I think, especially with Agamemnon, kind of absolutely narcissistic.
hmm
um, what else could they do? So I think that there's definitely, when you read the Greek plays, Sophocles, Euripides, etc., there is always an edge of, at least how I read them, of sympathy for these women. Clytemnestra is not just this terrible, unfaithful woman who kills Agamemnon, who kills her spouse, but look at the context that set this up. And I think a lot of the Greek playwrights are saying, let this be a warning of what absolute power does,
mm,
because Agamemnon, he destroyed a lot of people around him, and eventually he destroys himself. His actions destroy himself,
hmm
and every step he takes to try and gain more power, including uh, sacrificing his daughter, eventually leads to his downfall. And I think that that is an amazing lesson for today, as we look at the state of the world, and we're always wanting to get more power, get more attention, get more fame. But look at what that costs, and look how it hurts the people around you. And I think that goes back, to looking at how the women in these plays are portrayed, Clytemnestra and Medea.
It's so interesting. It goes right back to what you said earlier about virtue and what does it mean to be a virtuous person. And now I'm getting into the nitty and the gritty of my Greek mythology and
Yeah, go
Greek
for
history.
it. I could talk to you about this stuff all day. I love this.
Awesome. So yeah, because as you might be able to tell, I'm a nerd for this. So okay, so take something like the story of Antigone. When she's in that position, she claims power. She goes and she buries her brother, and against the king's wishes, and then she pays obviously a pretty hefty price. What do we do? What do we do now as far as activism? How do we relate that to people wanting, like, to Black Lives Matter movement, the Me
Yeah.
Too movement? All of those movements are those kinds of protests, and in the ancient plays there was death to come. Now we are in a hopefully much more enlightened place, but still we are faced with the same question: what am I risking if I speak up? What am I risking if I take action, like Antigone did?
Yeah. I think that that's a really good point, and I think yes, we don't risk death, uh, per se.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. But I know that I have some activist friends. I used to teach at a Unitarian seminary way back in the day, and a lot of the students I taught went on to be activists. I even had some at Charleston in 2017. I don't know if you recall that event
Mm-hmm.
with the
Of course.
white supremacist. But being an activist, from what I've heard of activists, I'm not an activist. Um, Part of me feels ashamed about that, but I'm not really an activist per se. But I admire activists. I greatly admire activists, and from what they have told me, it is a taxing thing. So you don't, it's not necessarily that your life is in danger. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is, but that the mental burden of of seeing all the problems in the world and trying to do something about it, and feeling like you're just making baby steps, and just such small just little headway, it is sometimes really overwhelming. And so I know that a lot of activists struggle with issues of mental health. So I think, going back to Antigone, I think that's a great example, because at the end it comes down to what type of decision does she make. She can
Mm,
back off and just have everything go back to normal, or uh, she can protest and be defiant. And what is the cost of that? And I think that's an extremely relevant question, for today. Even if like I said, there's no physical harm that comes to you. There is going to be some type of cost when you serve as an activist in the way uh, in a positive way. So there is going to be some type of mental cost, mental toll that it takes on you. And are you ready? Are you ready for that?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
if that makes sense.
Oh, it absolutely does. And we all have to evaluate for ourselves what we're going to do and how we're going to do it for sure. And I do want to say something, Adam, that I want to make this point very clear. Consider yourself an activist. You have taken on the extremely important job of teaching the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. If that's not an activist, I don't know what is, honestly. So
Thank you.
please do not ever be ashamed of not being perhaps on the front line at a march. You are an activist every single day when you walk into the classroom and you help these students, your students, discover and get curious and ask questions and make suppositions and learn. That is, if I were queen, honestly, or empress, uh professional basketball players would be making $30,000 a year and teachers would be making in the millions. So I wanted to say that that's really important for me, that you understand I hold you in the highest regard because you've taken on what I consider to be a sacred task.
Thank you, thank you. I definitely I consider it, sacred as well. My mother was a teacher. She taught for 40 years, and I saw how she influenced people so much, even years after. Um, and literally in the trenches of Baltimore, she literally saved some lives by the direction she was able to put students on. And so I always admired that about her. I mentioned Mr. Buto before,
Hmm.
so these are all people that I've looked up to, and I definitely I felt that their calling was sacred, and I feel like teachers' callings are sacred now. And at least in America, I don't think we teachers get enough praise.
Oh, not even a little. I've spent time working with teachers, and I go into schools to teach in one of my other gigs, and teachers are heroes, every single one of you. You're amazing. I want to, if it's okay, to switch gears just a little bit and
Certainly,
perhaps switch oceans, maybe cross an ocean, and let's cross the Atlantic and let's talk about ancient civilizations on the North American continent. Honestly, this is something that I've done some research before this interview, but I don't really know anything about it. And yet I've been to Snake Canyon and I've spent time in the Southwest. But I would love to speak with you a little bit about what that's about for you. What sparked your interest in ancient American civilizations, and what are your beliefs about these civilizations? Because there's plenty of stuff we just don't know.
yes.
So what got you started, and what is your focus about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. So, what got me started, honestly, Isolda, were my religious views, and I'll say a little bit about that. So, I was raised Baptist, then for most of my life. Then, when I got to grad school, kind of had a crisis of faith. Didn't really have any affiliation for a few years. Then spent some time with the Quakers, and then joined one of the Latter Day Saint movements, not the main one that you know of in Utah, but I'm an elder in what's known as the Church of Christ with the Elijah message. And all of the Latter Day Saint traditions, Community of Christ, the Utah Church, um, the Bickertonite Church, we are all kind of, how can I say, what the thing that holds us all together is our belief in something called the Book of Mormon, or the record of the Nephites, as my denomination calls it. And in the Book of Mormon, I'll just use the more common name. There's the idea that there were ancient civilizations that existed in North America, and that at some point Jesus came and visited these ancient civilizations. Now, that is a
Hmm.
faith claim. I'm not going to argue for that one way or another here on this show, but I will say that it got me very interested in trying to see and trying to research what ancient American civilization was like, because I'm sure it's probably the same for you. But when I was growing up, um, basically, when you asked about ancient American civilization, you were told of the Pilgrims, and they had a nice Thanksgiving meal with the Native Americans. and that was it. Now you knew a little bit about South America with the Mayans and the Incas, but nobody and the Aztecs, but um, nobody ever really talks about North America pre 1492. So really my interest in what can we know about ancient civilizations in America, stemming from my kind of religious background, made me get into this topic. And from my own research, from what I've been able to ascertain, North America just had just as much of a rich, elaborate culture with huge empires, thinking of the empires of the Hopewell and the Adena peoples, just as extensive, just as amazing as the empires of South America.
That's fascinating. So if that is true, if we have civilizations in sort of more north of where the Mayans and the Aztecs and Incas were, uh, w- uh, okay, I let's see if I can figure out how to ask this question. A few years ago, I visited Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico, and it's
Yes,
it's the most it's the only continuously in existence town or city, or community, I should say, uh, for since the 11th century, right? So,
yes,
so they've been around for a while, in part because they're so isolated. They're up on a big rock in the middle of the
yes,
desert. So those folks have been around, and we have some sort of continuous records of that happening. But
yes,
but what are the records that show that some of the more sort of northern American civilizations were in existence when, and again, I'm asking, I'm not trying to be impertinent or anything. I've never heard of primary sources that
yeah,
talk about the existence of these sorts of civilizations and peoples as you're
yes.
talking about. Please
No,
enlighten me.
no, that's a really good question. Most people haven't. I mean, I hadn't heard of this until I started doing research for it myself. There are not a lot of written records. Now, we do have some inscriptions, some Semitic inscriptions from some of these sites, which suggest that some of these early North American empires came from the Near East. And there's a lot of debate as to whether these inscriptions are forgeries or if they're legitimate. I tend to side on the view that they're legitimate. Well, when you look at them, with my background, I have a background in Semitic languages, Hebrew and Aramaic. Um, so, um, but not just the written records, mainly through the archaeological records. So, one of the things that I do as kind of the geek in me, I travel around to various Native American mounds, and I have often taken my kids. I have a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, so I take them with me basically all the time. And they get kind of bored. They're like, "Daddy's looking at his clumps of dirt again." But back in the day, thousands of years ago, they weren't actually clumps of dirt. They've been destroyed uh, by the present inhabitants of the region now. But back in the day, these mounds were huge, and some of them were as big as the dimensions of the pyramids of Egypt. And in the 19th century, as people have still found some of this stuff today, um, there were excavated at a lot of these mounds, excuse me, remains, skeletal remains of people who seem to have been rulers or decorated with jewelry, with all types of fancy items. And they also seem to have been slightly to somewhat significantly taller than modern human beings presently. So between 7 to 9 feet. So we know that these people were royalty of some type. They seem to have ruled the region around them. And we have this not only from what we've been able to determine from the archaeological record, but also from just the traditions of Native Americans. Native Americans talk about people who were here before and contemporaneous with their ancestors, and how these people basically um, were the rulers of these different civilizations that you have in the Midwest and in the Great Lakes region, etc. So, short answer to your question, to your really good question. the archaeological evidence, um, and the oral traditions of the Native Americans seem to strongly point to a massive empire in North America.
I grew up in Michigan and lived there until after I graduated from the University of Michigan. And one of the places that we went to was Serpent Mound.
Yes,
And so that, and I remember being there, and I could feel the energy of the place was different when you were nearby there. It just felt different than when you were a few miles away.
yeah,
And so they say that it was one of them was created by the Adena culture in
yes.
like 500, 800 BC to somewhere around there. Can you talk about what the significance, because we don't exactly know why that serpent mound is there, and I'm going to have to find a picture of it and put it up in the show notes for this because you can see that it's there when you're there, but really it's best seen from above.
Yeah.
So can you talk about what the significance of the serpent mound is? And well, what is it first of all, and what the significance of it is to someone like you who studies North American ancient cultures?
Certainly, certainly. I have not, sadly, I haven't been to the Serpent Mound. I've been to some others. I've been to the Newark Earthworks. I've been to the Fort Ancient Mound. I've been to the Adena Mound in Kentucky, but I have not yet gone to the Serpent Mound. But it's something that I hope to do. Maybe a summer road trip with the kids. I will do it. But yeah, the Serpent Mound is one of the longest uh, stretches just by its by feet. One of the longest mounds that exist in North America. And as you said, it's attributed to the Adena people who lived between 500 BCE and I believe 100 CE. Um, Depending, some people debate that. Some people say 500 BCE to 400 CE. Um, there seem to have been two major cultures in that region, the Adena and the Hopewell, and they seem to have fought with each other. And we don't actually know their original names. Hopewell and Adena were much later names given to them, named after the people who basically found their relics. So we don't know what their original names were. Um, but yeah, so this serpent mound, yeah, it's pretty amazing. It's really something that you can only see really well, just like the Newark mound from above. When you're actually there, you can't really see it very well. But we don't know why that serpent is there. There's a bunch of theories about that. Um, that this serpent may represent some form of Gnosticism or Gnostic religion amongst the Adena. The Adena, I should mention, along with the Hopewell, a lot of people, including myself, have speculated that their origins come from the Near East. So this could represent a reference to the biblical serpent tradition, um, where you have the serpent featuring prominently in the beginning of the Old Testament in the books of Genesis, or it could be the Gnostic serpent who provides wisdom. In the ancient Near East, in ancient Near Eastern context, serpents as well as women were understood as harbingers of wisdom. That's why in the Genesis story, Eve is talking to the serpent. The serpent's not interested in the guy because serpent doesn't feel like the dude is all that wise, but he is talking to the woman because they're kindred spirits, because they're both seen as harbingers of wisdom. So um, a lot of scholars, Isolde, have said, we're not sure what all of these mounds symbolize, but they were possibly used for ceremonial or religious purposes, and maybe some type of Gnostic ritual, Gnostic religious purpose uh, was evident at the Serpent Mound. But it's something I think this points to basically a larger issue that you know a lot more work. Now you have great archaeologists in the field of American archaeology, but a lot of this stuff has really kind of been overlooked. And you know, I think when you get to the mounds, a lot of archaeologists are content with the explanation that they're just ceremonial and don't really go into more depth with them. So I think that a lot of the new researchers out there, including myself, are trying to really get into this and say, yes, we see that there's this funky symbol here, but what can we possibly determine about it? Is it more than just, if it is ceremonial, what is the ceremony per se? Can we reconstruct any idea of the religious use of this particular mound site or that particular mound site?
I'm taking it all in for a second because there's so much to what you just said. So here I am. I am looking at the Serpent Mound or some of the other bandolier in New Mexico, some of these places where people have left an indelible mark of that they were there, whether or not we
Yes.
know what it meant. Somebody went, I'm going to let you know. I'm going to have this, for posterity, if you will. Not that they necessarily meant to do that, but it was a way of marking what was happening there.
Yeah.
And a few years, I go to Ireland a lot, and when we were traveling, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, I go to Ireland a lot, and I've spent time at the Hill of Tara,
Oh, wow.
and and Newgrange, and so Newgrange is 5,000 years old, or even older than that, maybe 7,000 years old. I believe it's 5,000 BCE is when it was built, over time, of course. But again, there are things there that when you're there, there are. At the winter solstice in Newgrange, for example, you are going to see the sun shine in at the winter solstice, and the 2 days around that date, the sun shines in all the way down 90 meters into the central altar, and it's the only time of the year it does that. So they knew to build it that way. And the same thing happens on the equinoxes in Tulum in Mexico. The same kind of, somebody went, you know what, we honor this so much that we're going to make this happen. And Stonehenge and other
Yeah.
such structures, if you will. So, do we have any instance of this in this part? Mexico, yes, but we're talking here specifically about sort of, I think, the Americas and the North American part of North America. Uh, and I hope I didn't just say something really insulting to anyone who lives in Mexico, but I guess what would now be considered the United States or Canada. Do we have anything like that here that we can point to and go, yeah, there somebody put that sort of thought into this the placement of these mounds or these structures?
Oh, yes. So there is a researcher, Sarah Farmer, and she goes into kind of into much more detail than I can about basically the astrological alignment of many of these mounds. And she argues that both with the solar and lunar calendar, they are aligned. So many of these seem to be astronomically aligned. Suggesting that exact there was an exact specific purpose to building these mounds.
Mhm.
Last October, I was for a church conference in Kentucky, and I got to see, I mentioned this before, the Adena Mound
Mhm.
there. And the Adena Mound in Kentucky, in Lexington, Kentucky, is really interesting because you can't see this exactly anymore because the river is dried up. But thousands of years ago, there was a river that ran parallel to the mound. So there's a small mound, there's
Mhm.
a river, then there's a small mound, and then there's a bigger mound next to it.
Mhm.
And this is interesting because we know some other scholars have written on this as well, such as Dr. Greg Little. But the river was seen not just in Native American thought, but you get this in the Bible as well, as a transition between life and death.
Sure.
It is believed that the river was either the river of premortality, where the soul slowly start to makes its way into the world. So the soul moves from the river to the small mound, and then the big mound, which represents human existence. Or it could be the opposite way of the soul leaving the physical realm with the big mound. Uh, Eventually entering the realm of the dead and then crossing over into the afterlife with the river. We're not quite sure. Either interpretation uh, could be argued for, but in that instance, I think is an excellent example where this mound is where you have mound building that seems to be deliberately planned. They
Mhm.
deliberately planned to build this mound near this river to kind of reflect a spiritual belief they had.
Some sort of a crossing over, like the river Styx, if we go
Yes,
back to
exactly. In Greek
Greek
mythology,
mythology.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
a really good example.
So going back to this notion of the modern lessons that we can learn. I was at a conference many years ago with Daniel Hillel. I don't know if you know who he is, biblical scholar and
Yes,
soil
yes,
scientist. And one of the things that he said was that when you look at the Old Testament in the Aramaic, that it's not dominion over the earth and the animals, that it's more like stewardship or caretaking.
yes,
And it changes everything. If you start ascribing that the notion of being caretakers rather than having dominion over our environment, over the beings we share the planet with, it changes that notion of virtue and that notion of how responsible we are, not to but for all of the different incredible natural resources we have.
yeah.
So when you're working, and you're an Aramaic scholar and a Hebrew scholar, when you're working on something like that, when you're looking at these old documents, can you talk a little bit about that notion of, am I choosing the right words? What do I have to do to make sure that I bring across the actual meaning of what is being said, when something like dominion versus stewardship or
Yeah.
caretaking has made such a significant difference in how many people view our relationship to the planet we live on?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a really kind of, I think that's an excellent example of kind of a negative history of interpretation. People taking the Hebrew term actually is mashal, so it means exactly like you said, nurturing, tender care for the environment, and you see this elsewhere in the Hebrew Torah. In Leviticus, this is something I talk about with my students in my Old Testament class, this environmental ethos that Leviticus has. Now we read Leviticus 18, and we're like, oh crap. Um, there's a lot of stuff in Leviticus that, yeah, that is problematic. But the thing that goes overlooked, and I try to emphasize this for my students, I'm like, don't just skip Leviticus, because in Leviticus, yes, you got some bad stuff, but also in Leviticus, you have this really strong environmental ethos where the children of Israel, the Bnei Israel, um, are supposed to take care of, nurture the land, and if they don't tend to the land and the land's needs, they are punished by God for doing that. So it's a much different view than what has kind of emerged from Western readings of the Bible. Uh, we intend to interpret that language as, I think, it's a misreading really that comes from Greek and Latin translations of the Hebrew Bible, reading mashal, excuse me, sorry, reading malach for mashal. So malach means to rule. This is where we get the word malek, king, from. So
Mhm.
to rule over and have dominion, that gets translated in the Septuagint and in the Vulgate as to lord over. Um, Dominatrix in Latin, but that is not what you get in the original Hebrew. I try to, wherever I see stuff like that, I try to emphasize and highlight that in my discussion with students. And also in my book, there's a chapter in Perspectives that deals with kind of the environmental ethos of the Old Testament. And I think there's a way to navigate that. If you give students too much Hebrew, if they didn't go to Hebrew school or something, they're going to get overwhelmed. But
Mhm.
I think that in instances where, I think this is an excellent example that you brought up, where it is definitely relevant and has had nefarious consequences in the way it's been interpreted. I think you can bring in Hebrew, and the students are able to understand that, and they feel really good because they feel like they know a little bit of Hebrew.
And, I lived in Israel for 7 months when I was a child, and Hebrew is not an easy language, so it's really
No.
it's wonderful. Nowadays, I could say "toda rabah" and "ken" and "lo," and that's it, and that's all I remember. But let's talk a little bit, actually, if you don't mind, about some of your, publishing work. When when you're doing it, I've written books, and I gotta tell you. non-academic publishing is very different than academic publishing.
Oh
Can you
yeah.
talk a little bit about, because I know there's this notion of publish or perish and all of that, but can you talk a little bit about what academic publishing is and what your experience of it has been?
Yes, yes. So academic publishing is, I would totally agree with you. Isolda is a whole different ball game than non-academic publishing, just because you have, how can I put it? Your subject, your topic is so limited. So even if you're dealing with the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, most people who are writing about it are specialized in a particular field. So um, my work, I didn't finish my PhD, but when I was working on my PhD, my focus was on the book of Job. Now, here's the problem, which is that everybody who has a specialty in your field is trying to write a book on the book of Job. Same thing in the classics. So um, there's a joke among classicists that, everything that's been written about Homer has already been written, so there's no need to write anything else. But there's more stuff published on Homer and on the Iliad and on the Odyssey than in any other academic field, including the sciences, including biblical studies, etc. So you're always trying to, your big task is to try and find something creative and new
Hmm.
within a field that within a topic that has been written on extensively. And a lot of times you're not going to really be able to find anything super new or super innovative. But what you can find, Isolda, is that what you can do is bring your own perspective to it, a perspective that hasn't been brought to the material before. I think in the classics, that you see a great example of this in several recent publications, several recent translations of the Aeneid and the Odyssey done by women, Emily Montgomery, I believe. But just kind of taking her experiences as a female classicist and bringing that to her translation of the Greek, and you start to see things. You start to, or you at least start to look at the text in a way that you haven't ever looked at the text before. So that is the main challenge. That is the main challenge uh, to writing in academia. The second challenge is that everything in academia, for good or bad, gets peer reviewed. So I remember um, the first project I ever worked on was a commentary for same book I'm actually working on now. I'm doing a project on now. I mentioned before for the NRSV, but the there was a commentary that I was writing for a book called the Africana Bible, which was basically Black American perspectives on the Old Testament. And I had to write on the editions of Daniel, which is one of the books of the Apocrypha, which is included in the Greek Bible, but it's not part of the original Hebrew text. I wrote my contribution. I had worked on it for several months. I wrote it in 2006, and it went through multiple peer reviews to the point that the final work wasn't published till around 2010. So it can take a really long time with all of the reviews and edits to get something published. Now, the good thing about publishing in academia, I've been working with something a publisher, Cognella Press, for about 3 or 4 years now. Wonderful, wonderful printing press. They have some great academic stuff. And the great thing about working within academic publishing is that usually, if you have a good publisher like I have, they're going to give you access to all types of resources that you wouldn't have even in your own home library. So you get to access databases with thousands and thousands of things. And so you have basically a plethora of resources from which to kind of formulate your own work. But it's not an easy process. There's a lot of peer review. There's a lot of them saying, this stinks. Go back, fix this up, submit it again, over and over and over again.
Hmm.
But if you get through it, it can be a very rewarding experience.
It's so interesting that you said that. I'm glad it's a rewarding experience. It would make me tear my hair out just because what happens when someone says, "Oh, this part is bad or this part is good," or whatever the corrections or notes that they have, what if you disagree? Is it incumbent upon you to change it because they said you had to, or can you sort of stick to your guns and go, "No, I really believe this, and this is what I'm going to
Yeah,
stay."
that's a great question. A lot of times, what I have learned, sometimes the hard way, is to pick and choose your own battles. Sometimes, if I feel very strongly about something, um, there was a whole article that I wanted to put into my Perspectives of the Old Testament book on Deborah, who is one of the female judges in the Old Testament. And there was a little bit of pushback, why can't we have an article that talks about, the judges in general? Well, I was like, my specific point is to, highlight a female judge. Now, we've all heard of Samson, we've heard of Samuel, but we haven't heard of Deborah that much. So
Mhm.
I pushed back on that and I was able to get that into my volume. Other times I've submitted stuff and I've been like, this work is so important. I at least want to get this subject matter out. I just want to get this perspective out that what pops out, what ends up on the printed page looks significantly different than what I first wrote down, but that I was able to get the general idea out. I made some compromises, but I was able to get the general idea out. So you have to pick and choose your battles.
Mm. Yeah, again, that would make me tear my hair out. uh, so this is sort of shifting gears just a little bit, if it's okay.
Sure.
W This is a little bit about the tools of your trade. So you're a scholar and you're a teacher and you're an author, and all of that is great. I worked at NASA for many years, and one of the things that I remember fascinating me a few years ago, I heard about using satellite data. They were able to, due to the amount of phosphorus in soil in a certain spot that wasn't supposed to have any kind of previous town or village on it, they found an entire village hidden under 30 feet of soil,
Yes.
essentially. So when you're doing that, and to me that's super exciting because then they were able to find all of these incredible sort of archaeological uh, mysteries solved because of why was there so much phosphorus? Oh, that's because there was a human settlement there. So what are the tools that you as a scholar use? Are you using that kind of lidar or some
Yeah.
other kind of satellite data to learn about some of these ancient historical places
Yeah.
in North America, or are you finding your sources being secondary sources and you go from what some of the other data collectors have done?
Mainly secondary sources, Isolda. Mainly secondary sources. LiDAR is amazing, but usually you have to be working within the context of academia um, to have resources for that.
Hmm.
Professors, tenured professors, spend years writing grants just to get access to that stuff.
Hmm.
I don't have that type of access. I do teach at um, an academic institution, but I don't have that type of access. So a lot of my work comes from what some dude with a light with lidar, ground penetrating radar, um, has done and written up
Hmm.
about his or her research, and
Hmm.
so I do that. A lot of my stuff is very much old school. I have various books on the subject by experts. Many of those experts are my friends. So I will contact them and say, hey, you wrote this. Is this what you meant? Or what can you tell me about this? I basically have a bunch of, concordances and encyclopedias and articles basically in my library at home
Hmm.
that I use. But I do, the millennial in me also uses digital sources as well. Um, but that's more limited than say if I was a tenured professor. I have access to some of that stuff, but not as much as if I was a tenured professor. And again, the nice thing, once you start writing for a particular publisher, they will give you what would cost you normally hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to have a subscription to something like JSTOR or something like that.
Hmm.
They will give you access to that. So I try to take advantage of that whenever I can.
Mm. Okay, because I was just wondering, it's so. I remember doing some of that work when I worked at NASA and seeing some of the results, and just I thought it was so fascinating to watch finding those kinds of touchstones, I guess I'll
Yeah,
say, to these ancient peoples is incredible.
yeah,
Have you
yeah.
found anything that has just proven false? Have you gone, oh, I had my hopes up, and this is just wrong. This is just not supported at all.
Yes, yes. So there was, which had been proven wrong before. Um, there was a finding in the late 1800s known as the Kindlehook plates,
Hmm.
which were supposed to be which was supposed to be a written document about the history of ancient America. There's a whole story, background story with Joseph Smith and the Mormon Church with these plates, and people over the years they were proven to be hoaxes, basically in like a year or so after they were supposedly found. But people through the years have tried to argue for them for their authenticity. And I really don't see it, which is disappointing because it'd be really cool if they were real because it gives more insight into the history of ancient America. But I don't think that they are, and you're gonna that's gonna happen a lot of times. Sometimes you're just gonna find a dead end, and the best thing you can do is just turn around and try again. But overall, I've been more amazed by what I have been able to find that's turned out to be legitimate
Hmm.
or have uh, something that can be verified rather than something that proves to be false.
So, what's next for you? I know that you're in the middle of writing a book and you're also teaching. If you could do anything, what would you be doing right now? What dig would you be on? What writing would you be doing?
I would be I'd probably be at the Serpent Mound
Mm,
or one of the mounds in Mississippi, doing research there if I could be anywhere right now. So I would love um, Native American mounds is something in the past couple of years that have kind of become my obsession. So
mm.
I would love to be doing that. But yeah, at the present time, I am working, like I mentioned, on the project, the commentary on the additions to Daniel for a new project with the NRSV. I'm also a monthly contributor to a magazine, Ancient American magazine. So I have an upcoming segment in there on the Los Lunas stone, which people have argued is a hoax, but there's seems to be a lot of evidence in its favor, and I talk about that. And then I'm always my Latter Day Saint faith is very, very important to me, so I'm always kind of writing, either reviewing somebody else's book or giving my own insights into Latter Day Saint history and theology. So those are the main things that I'm working on right now.
That's lovely. Very cool. Well, I know that you and I could be geeking out about
Oh,
mythology
absolutely.
for the next 6 hours, but I know you have a life and a day to get back to. So I would love it if you would do me a favor and
Certainly.
can you give sort of your social media links or where if somebody wanted to know more about your work or follow you online, would you mind just giving those so that I'll put them in the show notes, but it's always really helpful to have more than one way of finding the information.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I have, in addition to being a full-time Latin teacher at a high school, I'm also a Latin tutor, and I have a web page for my business on Facebook. If you go to Facebook and type in Lingua Classica, that's the name of my business, and I put in a lot of my work and just general stuff about Greek and Greco-Roman mythology on that site. So there's a lot of fun stuff on that site if you're just interested in the Greco-Roman world. I put stuff on there all the time, and then I also have an Instagram account, Adam the Giant Guy, where I put photos of different mounds that I visited. I put up information about ancient North America and also some fun stuff as well. So there's pictures of my kids and stuff on there as well. So those are my two main social media sites.
Fabulous. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for doing that, Adam. You know, it's interesting. I'm in the middle of revising my next book, and it's a mystery novel, and Roman
Wow.
mythology plays a role. And I had to translate from English into Latin. And it's too bad I didn't know you back then because it would, my Latin is probably just atrocious. So you might not ever want to read the book, but
I would love to
But
read the book. That seems pretty awesome.
yeah, Roman mythology plays a big role in the book. So, but yeah, it was fascinating to go, how on earth do I translate something that is very much modern sounding, the language I was speaking in modern English,
Yes.
and have it sound properly conjugated and the appropriate translation into Latin. And I'm
Yes.
sure that I'm way off, but oh well.
Well, I will just have to take a look at it, and I'll criticize you if you are.
Oh
So no, I
no,
would.
but it won't be peer reviewed because you obviously know so much more about this than I do. You're not, I'm not your peer. You're way past what I know how to do. Well, Adam, I want to thank you so much for being on the show and for taking the time to talk about this. It's so fascinating to see how these ancient peoples and ancient knowledge can be really informative to us today. I'm so grateful that you took the time.
My pleasure. I love talking about this stuff. Thank you so much for having me.
It was it was absolutely a delight. I have this one last question that I want to ask. It's a silly little question, but I find that it yields some poignant answers. And here's the question. Are you ready?
Certainly, I will go for it.
All right. So if you had a plane that could skywrite anything for the whole world to see, what would you say?
Um, ah, I think I would say carpe diem, in the words of Robin Williams, seize the day. And the reason I would say that is because so often we spend so much of our lives, thinking that things will happen to us. I'm not saying that good things won't happen to us, but a lot of times I've been guilty of this in the past. When we take initiative, we will be surprised at how doors open up for us. So don't be afraid to, get all out of your day that you can.
Oh, I love that. And I love that you quoted Dead Poets Society. It's one of my favorite movies.
Yes, me too, me too.
Oh, such a
So
brilliant, brilliant movie. And if you haven't seen it, I'm gonna put a link to that in the show notes too, because if you haven't seen it, you need to see
one
it.
of those films you need to see before you die. Absolutely.
Oh, completely. Just tremendous. And when I was talking to you about Professor Cameron at the University of Michigan, he was that kind of professor. The kind of teacher Robin Williams is in Dead Poet Society.
Wonderful,
Cameron was
wonderful.
that kind of teacher at the University of Michigan. So
That's awesome.
I highly recommend the movie, and also go find the works of Adam Stokes and the works of H.D. Cameron and read the Odyssey, because it's a great story.
Oh
Regardless of
yes.
anything else, it's a cool story. All right. This is Isolde Trachtenberg for the Innovative Mindset Podcast. I hope that you've enjoyed today's show. And if you have, I would love it if you would rate and review the podcast. Let me know what you're thinking. Let me know about episodes that I need to have on the show. As you can tell, I'm willing and ready and hopefully able to geek out about all sorts of topics. Until next time, once again, this is Isolde Trachtenberg reminding you to listen, learn, laugh, and love a whole lot. Thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. Please subscribe to the podcast if you're new. And if you like what you're hearing, please review it and rate it and let other people know. And if you'd like to be a sponsor of the show, I'd love to meet you on patreon.com/innovative mindset. I also have lots of exclusive goodies to share just with the show's supporters there. Today's episode was produced by Isolde Trachtenberg and is copyright 2021. As always, please remember this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Past performance does not guarantee future results, although we can always hope. Until next time, keep living in your innovative mindset.